The dust kicked up in angry swirls as Adelaide Calloway stumbled out of Miller's general store, her face burning with shame and her eyes stinging with tears she refused to let fall in public. Behind her, Horace Miller's voice boomed through the doorway, loud enough for half of Cripple Creek, Colorado to hear every humiliating word about unpaid debts and charity cases who thought they could take advantage of honest merchants. It was the summer of 1882, and Adelaide had been struggling to keep herself afloat ever since her father died in a mining accident 6 months prior. The modest claim he had worked for years had produced nothing but false hope and empty pockets, and when he passed, Adelaide found herself alone at 21 years old with debts she had not known existed, and a town that looked at unmarried women without family as either pitiable or suspicious. She pressed her back against the wooden railing outside the store, trying to calm her racing heart. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the dirt street, and the sound of piano music drifted from one of the saloons further down the road. Adelaide clutched her empty basket tighter, wishing the ground would open up and swallow her whole. She had needed flour, coffee, and lamp oil, but Miller had refused her credit, citing the $12 she already owed him from previous purchases made when her father was still alive, and she had believed those debts would be paid. "How much does she owe you?" The voice came from behind her, deep and quiet, and Adelaide turned to see a man she had noticed around town but never spoken to. He was tall, lean in that way men got when they spent more time working than eating, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of storm clouds. He wore dusty clothes, a weathered hat, and a gun belt that sat low on his hips. She had heard whispers about him, the lone cowboy who had drifted into Cripple Creek a few months back and kept mostly to himself, taking odd jobs at various ranches. Horace Miller appeared in the doorway, his round face still flushed with indignation. $12.30, not that it is any concern of yours, Emmett Quinn. Adelaide finally had a name to put to the face she had seen from a distance. She watched in stunned silence as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn leather wallet. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, as though he had all the time in the world and nothing Miller said could rattle him. "Emmett, you do not have to do this," Adelaide found her voice, though it came out shakier than she wanted. "I will find a way to pay him myself." Emmett did not look at her, keeping his attention on Miller as he counted out bills and coins. "$12.30, you said." He held out the money, and Miller's greedy fingers snatched it up quickly, as though afraid the cowboy might change his mind. "Add whatever she came in to buy today as well," Emmett said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Miller's expression shifted from annoyed to calculating. "That will be another $3.15. Emmett produced the additional money without hesitation. Adelaide felt her throat tighten, torn between gratitude and mortification. She was not accustomed to charity, and pride warred with desperation inside her chest. "I will get those items together," Miller said, disappearing back into the dim interior of his store with a speed that suggested he feared Emmett might reconsider. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the sound of a wagon rolling past and someone calling out a greeting from across the street. Adelaide forced herself to look at the man who had just paid her debts, studying his profile. His jaw was strong, shadowed with a few days of beard growth, and there was something about the set of his shoulders that spoke of a bone-deep weariness. "Why would you help me?" The question burst from her before she could stop it, raw and confused. "You do not even know me." Emmett finally turned to face her, and up close she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the small scar above his left eyebrow, the fullness of his mouth that softened the otherwise hard angles of his face. He looked at her for a long moment, and Adelaide felt something shift in the air between them, like the electric charge before a summer storm. "I know what it is like to be desperate and alone," he said simply. "I know what it is like to need help and have everyone turn away." His honesty disarmed her completely. Adelaide opened her mouth to respond, but Miller returned with a crate full of supplies, setting it down with a thump that sent up a small cloud of dust. "Pleasure doing business," Miller said, though his tone suggested anything but pleasure. He retreated into his store, and Adelaide heard the sound of the door being firmly closed behind him. Emmett picked up the crate as though it weighed nothing. "Where are you staying?" "I have a small cabin on the edge of town," Adelaide said, gesturing vaguely westward. "But I can carry that myself." "I am sure you can," Emmett replied, already stepping off the porch, "but I am going that direction anyway." It was obviously a lie, but Adelaide found herself following him anyway, her basket still clutched in her hands. They walked in silence through the bustling street, past the assay office and the post office, past the Paradise Saloon where rough laughter spilled out into the afternoon heat. People stared, and Adelaide knew by tomorrow morning the entire town would be buzzing with speculation about her and the mysterious cowboy. The cabin she had inherited from her father was modest, to say the least. One room with a small sleeping loft, a pot-bellied stove, and furniture her father had built with his own hands. It sat on a scrubby piece of land at the base of the mountains, with a view of the valley that was beautiful when Adelaide had the energy to appreciate it. Emmett set the crate down on the porch and straightened, pulling his hat off to wipe his forehead with his sleeve. His hair was dark and wavy, curling slightly at the nape of his neck. "Thank you," Adelaide said, knowing the words were inadequate but having nothing else to offer. "I will pay you back every cent. It might take me some time, but I swear I will do it." "There is no debt," Emmett said firmly. "What I did back there, that was not a loan. That was just one person helping another." "But $15, Adelaide protested. "That is not an insignificant amount of money." "Neither is a person's dignity," Emmett countered. He settled his hat back on his head, shadowing his eyes. "Miller had no right to humiliate you like that." Adelaide felt her eyes burn again, but this time she did not fight the tears that slipped down her cheeks. She was so tired of being strong, of pretending everything was fine when her world had crumbled around her. This stranger's kindness had cracked something open inside her, and she found herself unable to maintain the walls she had built so carefully. "I am sorry," she said, wiping at her face with trembling hands. "I do not usually fall apart like this." "You are not falling apart," Emmett said gently. "You are human. There is a difference." He pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and offered it to her. It was clean but worn soft from many washings, and Adelaide took it gratefully, pressing it to her eyes. "I should go," Emmett said after a moment. "But if you need anything, I am staying at the boarding house on 2nd Street, room 7. "Wait," Adelaide said, lowering the handkerchief. "At least let me make you supper. It is the least I can do." Emmett hesitated, and Adelaide could see him weighing the invitation, measuring it against some internal code she did not understand. Finally, he nodded once. "That would be nice," he said. "Thank you." Relief flooded through Adelaide, chased by a flutter of nervousness she had not felt in a long time. "Come back at sunset. I will have something ready." She watched him walk away, his long stride eating up the distance until he disappeared around a bend in the road. Only then did Adelaide allow herself to sink down onto the porch steps, holding his handkerchief in her hands like a talisman. The afternoon passed in a blur of activity, as Adelaide threw herself into preparing the best meal she could manage with her limited supplies. She made biscuits from the fresh flour, fried salt pork, and used some of her precious store of dried apples to make a simple pie. It was not fancy, but it was honest food, and she hoped it would be enough. As the sun began its descent toward the mountain peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, Adelaide changed into her only good dress, a simple blue cotton that brought out the color of her eyes. She brushed her dark blonde hair until it shone and twisted it into a neat bun at the base of her neck. Her hands shook slightly as she worked, and she told herself it was just nerves about having a guest, nothing more. Emmett arrived just as the first stars began to appear, carrying a bottle of wine that must have cost him dearly in a mining town where whiskey was the drink of choice. He had cleaned up as well, his face freshly shaved and his hair still damp from washing. "You did not have to do that," Adelaide said, taking the bottle with a smile. "You have already done too much." "Seemed rude to show up empty-handed," Emmett replied. There was a shyness to him that Adelaide had not expected, a vulnerability that made her own nervousness ease slightly. They ate at the small table by the window, the lamp casting warm light over the simple meal. At first, conversation was stilted, punctuated by long silences, but gradually they began to relax into each other's presence. Adelaide learned that Emmett was from Texas originally, the youngest son of a rancher who had left home at 17 to make his own way. He had worked cattle drives, broken horses, hired his gun out a few times to protect herds from rustlers, though he seemed reluctant to discuss that part of his past in detail. "What brought you to Cripple Creek?" Adelaide asked, cutting into her slice of apple pie. Emmett was quiet for a moment, turning his fork over in his hands. "I suppose I was looking for a place to stop running," he said finally. "I have been drifting for more than 10 years now, never staying anywhere longer than a season. Gets lonely after a while." The honesty in his voice made Adelaide's chest ache with recognition. "I understand that," she said softly. "Loneliness, I mean. Even before my father died, I was lonely. He was so consumed by his claim, by the idea that we were one strike away from being rich. He did not see me, not really. And now that he is gone, I feel like I am invisible to everyone." "I see you," Emmett said, and the intensity in his gray eyes made her breath catch. "I saw you the first day I rode into town, walking past the boarding house with your head held high even though I could see how tired you were. I saw you working in your garden, coaxing life out of this stubborn soil. You are anything but invisible, Adelaide." Hearing her name on his lips sent a warm shiver down her spine. "How did you know my name?" asked around, Emmett admitted, a faint smile tugging at his mouth. "Wanted to know who the pretty woman with the sad eyes was." Adelaide felt heat rise to her cheeks. It had been so long since anyone had called her pretty, since anyone had looked at her with anything other than pity or disdain. "You asked about me, more than once," Emmett said. "Could not seem to stop myself from wanting to know more." The air between them felt charged again, full of possibility and promise. Adelaide stood to clear the dishes, needing movement to ground herself, and Emmett rose to help. They worked side by side in the small space, their hands brushing occasionally, each touch sending sparks racing through Adelaide's body. "I should probably head back," Emmett said once the dishes were washed and dried, though he made no move toward the door. "Do not want to damage your reputation any more than I already have." "My reputation is already questionable," Adelaide said wryly. "An unmarried woman living alone, struggling to pay her debts. People will talk no matter what I do." "They should not," Emmett said with sudden fierceness. "You are trying to survive in a world that is stacked against women. There is no shame in that." Adelaide stepped closer to him, close enough to see the flecks of blue in his gray eyes, close enough to smell the faint scent of soap and leather. "Stay a little longer," she heard herself say. Please. I do not want to be alone tonight." Emmett's expression softened into something tender and wanting. He raised his hand slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, and cupped her cheek with a gentleness that made her throat tight. "Adelaide," he said, her name a question and a prayer all at once. She answered by rising on her toes and pressing her lips to his. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, two lonely people reaching for connection in the darkness. But then Emmett's arms came around her, pulling her close, and Adelaide melted into his strength, into the warmth of his body and the desperate way he kissed her back. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Emmett rested his forehead against hers. "I should still go," he said, though his arms remained locked around her waist. "I do not want you to think that I helped you because I expected anything in return." "I do not think that," Adelaide assured him. She pulled back enough to look into his eyes. "I think you are a good man who did a kind thing, and I think maybe we both deserve something good for once." Emmett stayed until the early hours of the morning, and they spent the time talking, sharing stories from their pasts, learning the shape of each other's hopes and dreams. He told her about the ranch he wanted to own someday, a place with good water and grass, where he could raise horses and cattle and build a life that meant something. She told him about her secret love of books, how she had taught herself to read beyond the basics, and dreamed of a library full of stories about places she would never see. When he finally left, with the reluctance of a man being pulled away from something precious, he kissed her once more at the door, a long, sweet kiss that tasted like promise. "Can I see you again?" he asked, his voice rough with exhaustion and emotion. "I would like that," Adelaide said, smiling up at him. "I would like that very much." The next few weeks passed in a golden haze of discovery. Emmett came by every evening after his work was done, sometimes bringing fresh meat from a successful hunt, sometimes bringing wildflowers he had picked on his way. They cooked together, ate together, talked until the stars wheeled overhead and the night air grew cold. Adelaide learned that Emmett was patient and thoughtful, that he listened when she spoke and remembered small details about her likes and dislikes. He fixed the sagging porch steps and patched the hole in the roof where rain had been leaking through. He never made her feel like she owed him anything, never held his help over her head. He simply gave, freely and generously, as though her happiness was payment enough. And Adelaide found herself falling for him, slowly and then all at once, like stepping off a cliff and discovering she could fly. She fell for the way he smiled when he saw her, like she was the best part of his day. She fell for the gentleness of his hands, calloused and scarred from years of hard work but so careful when they touched her. She fell for the sadness that lingered in his eyes sometimes, the weight of whatever ghosts he carried, because it made him real and human and beautifully flawed. But not everything was perfect. Adelaide could feel the town's judgment like a physical thing, pressing down on her whenever she walked the streets. Women whispered behind their hands when she passed. Men looked at her with a new sort of speculation that made her skin crawl. Reverend Walsh stopped her outside the post office one afternoon and suggested gently that perhaps she should consider moving away to live with relatives, that a young woman alone was vulnerable to all sorts of dangers. "I do not have any relatives," Adelaide had told him coolly. "And I am perfectly capable of taking care of myself." But the words rang hollow even to her own ears. The truth was, she was barely scraping by. Her father's claim was worthless, the debts kept piling up despite her best efforts, and winter was coming. She had no idea how she was going to make it through the cold months, and the fear kept her awake at night, staring at the ceiling and trying to figure out what to do. Emmett sensed her worry, even when she tried to hide it. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, he brought it up directly. "What is wrong?" he asked, taking her hand in his. "You have been distant the past few days." Adelaide sighed, leaning her head against his shoulder. "I am scared," she admitted. "Winter is coming, and I do not know how I am going to survive. I barely have enough money for food, let alone wood for heat, and all the other things I will need." Emmett was quiet for a long moment, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand. "Come live at the boarding house," he said finally. "They have rooms available, and it would be warmer and safer than staying out here alone." "I cannot afford the boarding house," Adelaide said, frustration creeping into her voice. "That is the whole problem, Emmett. I cannot afford anything." "Then let me help you," Emmett said. "Let me pay for your room until you can get on your feet." "Absolutely not," Adelaide said, pulling away from him. "I will not be kept like some saloon girl. People already talk about us enough as it is." "I do not care what people say," Emmett shot back, his own frustration showing. "I care about you being safe and warm and fed." "Well, I care about my reputation," Adelaide said, standing up and pacing the length of the porch. "Maybe that sounds silly to you, but it is all I have left. If I lose that, I lose everything." Emmett stood as well, catching her hand and pulling her to a stop. "Then marry me," he said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "Marry me, Adelaide. Live with me as my wife, not as someone I am keeping. Let me take care of you because I love you, not out of pity or obligation." Adelaide stared at him, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. "You love me." "Of course I love you," Emmett said, and there was no hesitation in his voice, no doubt. "I think I have been falling in love with you since the moment I saw Horace Miller treating you like you were nothing. You are everything, Adelaide. You are strong and brave and kind, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving to you that you deserve to be loved." Tears streamed down Adelaide's face, but for the first time in months, they were tears of joy rather than despair. "I love you too," she whispered. "I did not think I would ever feel this way about anyone, but you have changed everything." Emmett pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. "Is that a yes?" he asked against her hair. "Will you marry me?" "Yes," Adelaide said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, I will marry you." They were married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the church, with the preacher's wife and the owner of the boarding house as witnesses. Adelaide wore a cream-colored dress that the preacher's wife had helped her sew from fabric Emmett had bought, and Emmett wore his Sunday best, looking nervous and handsome and so full of love that Adelaide felt like her heart might burst. As they spoke their vows, promising to love and cherish each other through whatever life brought their way, Adelaide felt something settle deep in her soul. She was no longer alone. She had a partner, someone who saw her and valued her and wanted to build a life with her. It was more than she had ever dared to hope for. They moved into Emmett's room at the boarding house temporarily, planning to save money for a place of their own. The room was small, barely big enough for a bed and a dresser, but Adelaide did not care. Lying in Emmett's arms at night, listening to the steady beat of his heart, she felt safer and more content than she had in her entire life. The town's attitude toward Adelaide shifted slightly after the wedding. She was no longer a scandalous woman living alone but a respectable married woman. Some people remained cold and judgmental, but others began to warm to her, especially when they saw how hardworking and devoted both she and Emmett were. Emmett took a permanent position at the Diamond Cross Ranch, one of the larger spreads outside of town. The work was hard and the hours long, but the pay was steady and came with the promise of a small house on the property that they could move into come spring. Adelaide took in sewing and laundry to bring in extra money, and slowly, painfully slowly, They began to build something that felt like stability. Winter came hard and fast that year, with snow piling up in drifts higher than a man's head and temperatures that dropped so low the water in the basin would freeze solid overnight. But Adelaide and Emmett weathered it together, huddled close in their small room, making plans for their future and learning the rhythms of married life. Adelaide discovered that Emmett snored lightly when he slept on his back, and that he always woke before dawn, no matter how late they stayed up talking. Emmett learned that Adelaide hoarded books like other women hoarded jewelry, and that she sang softly to herself when she thought no one was listening, her voice clear and sweet as a bell. They had their first real fight in January, over something Adelaide could barely remember later, but what stuck with her was the way they worked through it. Emmett did not storm off or shut down. Instead, he stayed and listened and talked until they found their way back to understanding. They learned that disagreements did not mean the end of love, that two people could clash and still choose each other at the end of the day. Spring came eventually, melting the snow and turning the roads into rivers of mud. Emmett took Adelaide out to see the house at Diamond Cross Ranch, and though it was small and needed work, Adelaide loved it on sight. It had 2 rooms, a proper kitchen with a wood stove, and windows that looked out over rolling pastures where cattle grazed. They spent weeks fixing it up, scrubbing and painting and making it their own. Adelaide planted a garden, and Emmett built furniture to fill the empty spaces. The ranch owner, a gruff but fair man named Henry Douglas, took a liking to them both and gave Emmett more responsibilities, along with a raise in pay. Life settled into a comfortable routine. Emmett worked long days on the ranch, tending cattle and mending fences and doing the 1,000 other tasks that kept a spread running. Adelaide kept house, tended her garden, and continued taking in sewing work to contribute to their savings. In the evenings, they would sit together on the porch and watch the sunset, talking about their day and making plans for the future. One evening in late June, as the air filled with the sweet scent of blooming wildflowers, Adelaide realized she had not had her monthly courses in more than 2 months. The realization filled her with a mix of excitement and terror. She waited another week to be sure and then another before finally telling Emmett. "I think I am with child," she said one night as they lay in bed, her head resting on his chest. Emmett went very still beneath her. "You think?" "I am fairly certain," Adelaide said. "All the signs are there." Emmett sat up, pulling her with him, and even in the darkness she could see the wonder in his eyes. "We are going to have a baby." "Yes," Adelaide said, unable to keep the smile from her voice. "We are going to have a baby." Emmett let out a whoop of joy that probably woke half the ranch, then gathered her into his arms and spun her around the small room until they were both dizzy and laughing. "I am going to be a father," he kept saying, like he could not quite believe it. "We are going to be parents." The pregnancy was not easy. Adelaide suffered from terrible morning sickness that lasted well into the afternoon, and as the baby grew, so did her aches and pains. But Emmett was endlessly patient and attentive, bringing her tea and crackers in the morning, rubbing her swollen feet at night, talking to her belly about all the things he was going to teach their child. "If it is a boy, I will teach him to ride and rope and how to be a good man," Emmett said one evening, his hand splayed across Adelaide's rounded stomach. "If it is a girl, I will teach her all those things too, and also how to shoot straight so no man can ever take advantage of her." "What if she wants to learn sewing and cooking instead?" Adelaide teased. "Then I will learn sewing and cooking so I can help her," Emmett said seriously, and Adelaide fell in love with him all over again. As Adelaide's belly grew, so did the reality of their situation. They needed more supplies, more money, more of everything to prepare for the baby's arrival. Emmett started taking on extra work, hiring himself out on his days off to help other ranchers or anyone else who needed an extra set of hands. Adelaide tried to keep up with her sewing, but as she grew larger and more uncomfortable, it became harder to sit for long periods. Money got tight again, tight enough that they began skipping meals to stretch their supplies. Adelaide tried to hide her worry from Emmett, but he saw through her brave face. "We are going to be all right," he told her one night, holding her close. "I will make sure of it. You and our baby will never go without, I swear it." "You cannot control everything," Adelaide said softly. "Sometimes life just happens and all we can do is our best." "Then I will do better than my best," Emmett said fiercely. "I will do whatever it takes." 2 weeks later, Henry Douglas offered Emmett a partnership opportunity. One of the smaller ranches neighboring Diamond Cross was going under, and Douglas wanted to buy it and expand his operation. He needed someone he trusted to manage the new property, and he was willing to offer Emmett a percentage of the profits in addition to his regular wage. It was an incredible opportunity, one that could change their lives completely. But it also meant more work, longer hours, and time away from Adelaide when she needed him most. They talked about it long into the night, weighing the pros and cons, trying to figure out the right path forward. "I want you to take it," Adelaide finally said. "This is the kind of chance that does not come around twice. We can manage for a few months and then things will be easier." "Are you sure?" Emmett asked, searching her face. "I do not want you to feel like I am abandoning you." "You could never abandon me," Adelaide said, taking his hand and placing it over her heart. "You are right here always. A few extra hours of work does not change that." Emmett accepted the partnership, and true to his word, he threw himself into the work with everything he had. He was gone before sunrise and often did not return until after dark, exhausted and covered in dust, but determined. Adelaide tried to be understanding, but loneliness crept back in during those long days alone, and fear that something would go wrong with the pregnancy when Emmett was not there to help. Her fears were not unfounded. One afternoon in early December, when Adelaide was 8 months along, she was carrying water from the well when she slipped on a patch of ice. She managed to catch herself before she fell, but the jar sent a sharp pain through her belly and lower back. By evening, the pain had intensified into regular contractions. Emmett was not home, and Adelaide had no way to reach him. She managed to hitch up their horse and wagon, though every movement sent waves of agony through her body, and drive herself into town to the doctor's office. "Doctor." Brennan took one look at her pale, sweating face and immediately helped her inside. "The baby is coming early," he said after examining her. "About a month early by my estimation. We need to get you settled and prepare for delivery." Adelaide wanted to wait for Emmett, wanted him there to hold her hand and tell her everything would be all right. But babies came on their own schedule, and hers was apparently in a hurry. The labor was long and brutal, lasting through the night and into the next morning. Adelaide had never known pain like this, pain that consumed her entire being and made her think she might die from it. But she did not die. As the sun rose on a cold December morning, Adelaide brought a son into the world. He was small, smaller than Dr. Brennan would have liked, but he had strong lungs and a will to live that showed in every lusty cry. "You have a fighter here," Dr. Brennan said, placing the tiny, squirming bundle in Adelaide's arms. "He is going to be just fine." Adelaide looked down at her son's red, wrinkled face and felt her heart expand in ways she had not known were possible. He had dark hair like his father and her blue eyes, and when he wrapped his tiny hand around her finger, she knew she would do anything, sacrifice anything, to keep him safe. Emmett arrived an hour later. Having ridden hard from the ranch, the moment one of the hands told him Adelaide had gone into town, he burst through the door of the doctor's office wild-eyed and terrified, and the relief on his face when he saw Adelaide sitting up in bed with their son was almost comical. "I am sorry," he said, coming to kneel beside the bed. "I am so sorry I was not here." "You are here now," Adelaide said, shifting the baby so Emmett could see him better. "Meet your son." Emmett reached out with trembling hands to touch the baby's soft cheek, his eyes filling with tears. "He is perfect," he whispered. "You are both perfect." They named him Ethan Cole Quinn, and he became the center of their universe. Emmett reduced his hours at the ranch to help with the baby, and though it meant less money coming in, neither of them regretted the decision. These early days were precious and fleeting, and they wanted to experience them together. Fatherhood suited Emmett in ways Adelaide had not anticipated. He was patient and gentle with Ethan, not at all uncomfortable with diapers and crying and all the messy realities of caring for an infant. He would pace the floor for hours at night when Ethan was fussy, singing old trail songs in his rough voice until the baby settled. He built a cradle with his own hands, sanding it smooth so there would be no splinters, and carved Ethan's name into the headboard with painstaking care. Adelaide watched him with their son and fell even more deeply in love. This was the life she had dreamed of without knowing it, this warmth and connection and shared purpose. Every difficult moment from the past year faded in significance compared to the joy of watching Emmett make silly faces to get Ethan to smile, or seeing the tenderness with which he cradled their tiny son against his broad chest. The partnership at the ranch paid off even better than Emmett had hoped. By the time Ethan was 6 months old, they had saved enough money to make a down payment on a small piece of land of their own. It was not much, just 40 acres with a creek running through it and enough grazing for a modest herd, but it was theirs. Emmett continued working at Diamond Cross while slowly building up their own place, and Adelaide helped however she could while caring for Ethan. They built a new house together, larger than the one at Diamond Cross, with room for their family to grow. It had a real parlor with a fireplace, a kitchen big enough for Adelaide to work comfortably, and 3 bedrooms upstairs. Emmett insisted on a large porch that wrapped around 2 sides of the house, remembering all those evenings they had spent watching sunsets and talking about their dreams. The day they moved into their own home was one of the happiest of Adelaide's life. She stood in the empty parlor with Ethan on her hip and looked around at the fresh painted walls and the windows that let in floods of golden light, and she felt like she had finally found her place in the world. "What do you think?" Emmett asked, coming to stand beside her. "Does it feel like home?" "It feels like everything," Adelaide said, leaning into his side. "It feels like all the hard times were worth it to get here." Emmett kissed the top of her head. "The hard times are not over," he said. "Running a ranch is difficult work, and there will be setbacks and struggles." "I know," Adelaide said, "but we will face them together, and that makes all the difference." Life on their ranch was indeed difficult. There were seasons when the cattle got sick, when the weather turned harsh and they lost animals they could not afford to lose. There were times when money was so tight they ate beans and cornbread for weeks on end. There were moments when Adelaide wondered if they had made a terrible mistake trying to build something from nothing, but there were also moments of transcendent joy. Watching Ethan take his first steps, chasing after the barn cats with delighted laughter. Sitting on the porch with Emmett after a long day, their hands clasped together, watching the stars come out one by one. Waking up on cold winter mornings with her family warm and safe under the same roof. When Ethan was 3 years old, Adelaide discovered she was pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, perhaps because she knew what to expect, or perhaps because she was not dealing with the crushing stress and uncertainty of their early days together. She delivered a healthy baby girl in the spring, and they named her Emma Grace Quinn. Emma had Adelaide's blonde hair and Emmett's gray eyes, and from the moment she entered the world she was a force of nature. She cried louder, laughed harder, and demanded attention with an intensity that left them all exhausted and enchanted. Ethan was fascinated by his baby sister, wanting to help with everything from diaper changes to feeding, and Adelaide's heart swelled watching her children together. The ranch continued to grow slowly but steadily. Emmett proved to have an excellent eye for quality cattle, and word spread that Quinn's stock was some of the best in the region. They hired a few ranch hands to help with the work, young men who reminded Adelaide of Emmett when he first drifted into Cripple Creek, looking for a place to belong. Adelaide started a small vegetable garden that grew over the years into a substantial operation. She sold her excess produce in town, and her preserves became so popular that she could barely keep up with demand. The money she earned went into savings for the children's future, a nest egg that grew steadily over time. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Emmett surprised Adelaide by taking her back to Cripple Creek. They left the children with one of the ranch hands and his wife, and spent the day walking through the town that had brought them together. "I want to show you something," Emmett said, leading her toward Miller's General Store. The place looked the same as it had 5 years ago, though Horace Miller had added a fresh coat of paint to the exterior. "Why are we here?" Adelaide asked, not particularly eager to see the man who had humiliated her all those years ago. Emmett just smiled and pulled her inside. Miller was behind the counter, looking older and grayer, and his eyes widened when he saw them. "Emmett Quinn," Miller said, "and Adelaide. I heard you two got married and started a ranch." "We did," Emmett said, "and we have done quite well for ourselves." He pulled out a wallet and counted out $15.15, setting it on the counter. "This is what I paid for Adelaide's debts that day, plus interest." Miller stared at the money like he did not understand what he was seeing. "You did not have to do that. That was years ago, and I told you it was not a loan." "It was not about you," Emmett said, his voice firm but not unkind. "It was about showing Adelaide that we have come far enough that debts from the past do not define us anymore. We are not those desperate people we were 5 years ago. We built something together, and no one can take that away from us." Adelaide felt tears prick her eyes, understanding what Emmett was really saying. They had transformed their lives through hard work, love, and sheer determination. The broken, lonely people they had been were still part of them, but they were no longer defined by their struggles. They left the money with a confused Miller and walked back out into the sunshine hand in hand. As they strolled past the place where Emmett had first approached her, Adelaide stopped and turned to face her husband. "Thank you," she said, "for that day and for every day since. You gave me more than money when you helped me. You gave me hope and a reason to keep fighting and a love I never thought I would find." "You gave me all of those things too," Emmett said, pulling her close. "I was so lost before I met you, Adelaide. I did not even realize how empty my life was until you filled it up with light and laughter and purpose. Every good thing I have, every dream that has come true, started the day I walked into Miller's store and saw you standing there with your head held high even though your heart was breaking." They kissed there on the street, not caring who saw them. Two people who had found each other in the midst of darkness and built a life filled with light. The years continued to pass, bringing both challenges and triumphs. When Ethan was 7 and Emma was 4, Adelaide gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl they named Edward James and Eliza Rose. The ranch flourished, growing from a modest operation to one of the most successful in the area. Emmett's reputation as an honest rancher and skilled cattleman brought opportunities for partnership and expansion that he carefully considered before accepting. But success did not change the core of who they were. Emmett still worked alongside his ranch hands, getting just as dirty and tired as any of them. Adelaide still took in her vegetable garden and made her preserves, teaching Emma and Eliza as they grew old enough to help. They raised their children with the same values that had guided them through their own hard times: integrity, perseverance, compassion, and the understanding that helping others was never wasted effort. Ethan grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved the ranch and the animals with a passion that reminded Adelaide of his father. Emma was wild and adventurous, always climbing trees and racing her brothers, and getting into trouble that she would talk her way out of with her father's charm and her mother's intelligence. The twins were still young, but already Edward showed signs of being gentle and artistic, while Eliza was tough and determined, afraid of nothing. On quiet evenings, when the children were asleep and the ranch was peaceful under the stars, Adelaide and Emmett would sit on their porch just as they had dreamed of doing all those years ago. Sometimes they talked about the day's events or made plans for the future. Sometimes they simply sat in comfortable silence, hands clasped, content in the knowledge that they were exactly where they belonged. "You ever think about that day at the general store?" Adelaide asked one such evening, her head resting on Emmett's shoulder. "About how different our lives would be if you had not stepped in." "I think about it sometimes," Emmett admitted. "But I do not think I could have walked away even if I tried. Something about you called to me, Adelaide. Some recognition that we were meant to find each other, to build this life together." "I asked you why you would help me," Adelaide said softly. "Do you remember what you said?" "That I knew what it was like to be desperate and alone," Emmett replied, "and it was true. But what I did not say, what I barely understood myself at the time, was that I was also desperate to matter to someone, to have my life mean something beyond just survival." "You matter," Adelaide said fiercely, lifting her head to look at him. "You matter to me, to our children, to everyone whose life you have touched. You are not just a good man, Emmett Quinn. You are an extraordinary man, and I thank God every day that you walked into that store when you did." Emmett cupped her face in his hands, his eyes shining with emotion in the lamplight spilling from the windows. "I love you, Adelaide, more than I thought it was possible to love another person. You took a broken, drifting cowboy and gave him a home, a family, a reason to be better than he thought he could be." "I love you too," Adelaide whispered, "always and forever." They kissed as they had kissed 1,000 times before, with the easy intimacy of long familiarity and the spark that had never faded. As they drew apart, Adelaide felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. This was her life, this man and this ranch and these children, and it was more beautiful than any story in any book she had ever read. The years rolled on, bringing the joys and sorrows that make up a life well lived. There were hard winters and drought summers, sick animals and failed crops, moments when the weight of responsibility felt crushing. But there were also weddings and births, bumper harvests and record sales, moments of triumph that made all the struggles worthwhile. Ethan eventually took over the day-to-day running of the ranch, showing the same dedication and integrity his father had modeled. Emma married a surveyor and moved to Denver, but she visited often with her own growing family. Edward pursued his artistic interests, becoming a respected craftsman who made furniture and carved decorative pieces that were sought after throughout Colorado. Eliza became the first woman rancher in the region to run her own spread, managing a property she purchased with money saved from years of working alongside her father and brother. Adelaide and Emmett grew older together, their hair turning silver and their faces etching with the lines of a life filled with laughter and love. They became grandparents, and then great-grandparents, watching their family tree extend branches they could never have imagined in those early, desperate days. On their 40th wedding anniversary, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, Emmett stood to make a toast. His voice was rougher now, weathered by age, but it still carried the strength that Adelaide had fallen in love with. 40 years ago, I was a lonely cowboy with nothing to my name but a horse, a gun, and a heart full of emptiness I did not know how to fill, he said. And then I saw a woman being treated poorly in a general store, and something in me said this matters, she matters. I paid a debt that day that was not mine to pay, and in return, I received a gift beyond measure. Adelaide became my wife, my partner, my everything. She gave me children and grandchildren and a legacy that will live on long after we are gone. So I want to say thank you, Adelaide, for asking me why I helped you. Because in answering that question, in finding the courage to step forward when you needed someone, I found my own salvation. Adelaide stood and took his hand, her eyes wet with happy tears. And I want to thank you for seeing me when I felt invisible, for giving me hope when I had none, and for loving me so completely that I learned to love myself. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Emmett Quinn, and I would choose you again in every lifetime. The room erupted in applause and cheers, and Adelaide and Emmett kissed to the delight of their assembled family. In that moment, surrounded by the life they had built together from nothing but determination and love, Adelaide felt the circle complete. They had started as two broken people reaching for connection in the darkness, and they had created something luminous and lasting. As the celebration continued around them, Adelaide leaned close to Emmett and whispered, "We did it. We built the life we dreamed about on all those evenings sitting on the porch." "We did more than that," Emmett replied, his arm tightening around her waist. "We built something that will outlast us, something that will echo forward through generations. Our love story did not end with us, Adelaide. It is just beginning for all of them." And he was right. The legacy of that single act of kindness in a dusty general store in Cripple Creek, Colorado, in 1882, rippled forward through time. It taught their children that compassion mattered, that helping others was never wasted, that love could transform even the most broken circumstances into something beautiful. Those lessons were passed down to grandchildren and great-grandchildren, creating a family rooted in the values that Adelaide and Emmett had lived by. As Adelaide and Emmett entered their twilight years, they remained inseparable. They spent their days on the porch they had built together, watching the ranch they had created continue to thrive under Ethan's careful management. They told stories to their great-grandchildren about the old days, about hardship and hope, and the power of choosing kindness, even when the world seemed cruel. When Emmett passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 87, Adelaide held his hand and whispered the same words she had spoken on their wedding day. "I love you, always and forever." She knew her own time was limited, felt it in the weariness of her bones and the slowing of her heart, but she was not afraid. Death was simply the next adventure, and wherever Emmett had gone, she would follow soon enough. True to her intuition, Adelaide passed away 3 months later, surrounded by her children and with Emmett's name on her lips. They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the ranch, beneath matching headstones that read simply, "Emmett Quinn and Adelaide Quinn, beloved partners in life and love. But their story did not end with their deaths. It lived on in every person they had touched, in every life they had changed, in every act of kindness inspired by their example. The ranch continued to prosper, remaining in the Quinn family for generations. The vegetables Adelaide had grown evolved into a commercial operation that provided fresh produce throughout the region. The furniture Edward crafted became heirlooms passed down through families. The ranch Eliza built became a model for other women seeking to make their own way in a male-dominated world. And on quiet evenings, when the sun set over the Colorado mountains in shades of orange and gold, members of the Quinn family would gather on porches and tell the story of how it all began. They would speak of a lonely cowboy and a desperate woman who met in a general store, of a debt paid and a question asked, of love that transformed two broken people into something whole and beautiful and lasting. "Why would you help me?" Adelaide had asked on that long-ago summer day, her voice full of confusion and wonder. And in living the life they built together, in creating a legacy of compassion and love that stretched across generations, Emmett had answered that question in the most profound way possible. He had helped her because some connections transcend logic and reason, because two souls can recognize each other across the darkness and choose to be each other's light. He had helped her because in lifting her up, he had lifted himself up as well. He had helped her because love, in all its messy, complicated, beautiful glory, was always worth the risk. Their great-great-grandchildren, playing in the yard of the ranch house that had been expanded and modernized but still retained the original structure Adelaide and Emmett had built, had no way of knowing the details of their ancestors' struggles. They could not truly understand what it meant to be desperate and alone in the harsh landscape of the 1880s American West. But they understood the essential truth at the heart of the story, the lesson that had been passed down through blood and bone and bedtime tales, that kindness matters, that love transforms, and that the smallest act of compassion can change the entire trajectory of a life. The ranch still stood strong more than a century after Emmett had paid Adelaide's debt at Miller's General Store. The land still produced, the cattle still grazed, the vegetables still grew in neat rows during the summer months. And on the hill where two weathered headstones marked the resting place of the couple who had started it all, wildflowers bloomed every spring, bright and beautiful and eternal. This was the legacy of love, built one day at a time, one choice at a time, one act of kindness at a time. This was the answer to Adelaide's question, written not in words but in lives lived fully, in children raised with compassion, in a community made better by two people who refused to let hardship make them hard. And somewhere, in whatever place souls go when they leave this world, Adelaide and Emmett were together still, watching over the family they had created and the love they had nurtured into something that would never truly die. Their story had become myth, and their love had become legend, but at its heart remained a simple truth, that in a dusty general store in Cripple Creek, Colorado, on a summer day in 1882, two lonely people had found each other and chosen to build something beautiful from the ashes of their separate despairs. That choice, that moment, that single act of unexpected kindness had been the seed from which an entire forest had grown. And generations later, people still sat in the shade of those trees, grateful for the two brave souls who had planted them and tended them with love, determination, and an unshakable belief that tomorrow could be better than today if they only had the courage to reach for it together.